Okay, Dan,
All right.
please
Well,
feel free to start.
let me welcome everybody. I had hoped to make this closer to real life by being able to see everybody, but at least I can see some of you sometimes. I am actually truly delighted to be doing this, because not only because it's an important topic, the legacy of the 9/11 tragedy for justice and advocacy, but also because, frankly, three of the four panelists I have one or another kind of personal relationship with. Charles Jennings, of course, is a colleague here and friend at John Jay, and another faculty member, as am I. Leo Boyle was president of the what's now called the Association for the Advancement of Justice, formerly known as the American Trial Lawyers Association. And I was, for 2 years, executive director and general counsel to the New York State Trial Lawyers Association, one of the components of his larger national organization. So we have a kind of connection there. And as Mindy mentioned earlier, Dietrich, Snell, and Mindy and I all served in the Attorney General's office for several years. And Mindy, of course, has been a colleague and friend for a very long time. But Dieter was one of my absolute favorite people at the AG's office, in addition to his service. Actually, I guess I should do some brief introductions, although I think people will introduce themselves more fully in a moment. But Dieter was the Deputy Attorney General for all of our affirmative litigation from the AG's office, went on to be senior counsel to the National Committee investigating the 9/11 disaster, and is now a partner at the Proskauer Rose law firm. Also happens to be an excellent cellist, which he didn't include in his bio, but of course I knew that. Leo, as I said, was not only president of the Massachusetts Bar Association for, I think, quite some time, and but president of the National American Association for Justice, which is the preeminent trial lawyers organization in the world, and an organization that I am quite familiar with, does very important work in the advancement of justice generally. Charles is, of course, here at John Jay in our emergency management department, which he has chaired or led the program of from time to time, and is an expert in his field. Unfortunately, I don't have a personal connection with the commissioner, but I hear she's quite wonderful as well. The commissioner of the aging, Jennifer Cortes-Vazquez, and I am, as I said, just delighted to be here with all of you. With that, perhaps before we go to specific questions, maybe let me ask you to introduce yourselves for a bit. Why don't we just do the reverse order of what I just did? So, Commissioner, if you would lead off, that would be great.
Great. Well, Mindy and I have a relationship because we both served in the short-lived Spitzer tenure in Albany, maybe a decade and a half ago. And my name is Lorraine Cortes-Vazquez. I'm the commissioner for the aging, and my relationship with 9/11 is because I was served as the Hispanic Federation president during that tenure, and during that time, and I worked 4 blocks away from the Twin Towers. So there's a lot to share. But as my role as the Department for the Aging Commissioner, we're involved in a lot of emergency management because, as you know, the older adults in New York have been greatly affected by some of the natural disasters, the unusual natural disasters we have had in New York, as well as, this pandemic. So we have an Office of Emergency Management also.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Charles, you want to take it?
Sure, Dan. First of all, thanks to the for organizing the panel at the Teaching and Learning Center. And so I've got kind of an interesting or unusual background, is that I've had a long practitioner experience that has run, in some cases, predates and then ran parallel to my time here at the college. I've been at John Jay since 1997. And with the exception of 5.5 years in which I left the college after 9/11 to go to White Plains, New York, to serve as the deputy commissioner and ultimately the first deputy commissioner of public safety, which was an exciting time in terms of tooling up a combined police, fire, kind of a one-stop public safety agency. So we had responsibility for emergency management, EMS, fire, and police, all reporting to a commissioner. And so it's an interesting way to organize services. And it gave us a lot of leverage and ability to do some things that were innovative. I think still are innovative. And here at the college, I think most relevant to this panel is I've had a long involvement in fire safety, high-rise buildings in particular, and was instrumental in starting the college's first graduate concentration in emergency management, which was the first in the New York metropolitan area back in, we actually started in 2000 and actually rolled it out in September of 2001. And so we've since grown that program to a full master's degree, and we're very pleased with it. But so I've got expertise and got involved related to 911 and a lot of advocacy work by virtue of having called for an independent investigation into the response to the World Trade Center attack. And we can talk more about that, but got together with Sally Regenhard, who was at that time just a mother of a missing New York City firefighter who was looking for answers. And so we got Glenn Corbett and I got quoted in the Daily News, and all of a sudden we got this voicemail from some firefighter's mom. And so that started us on a real roller coaster ride, which we'll talk about later. Thanks.
Thank you. Leo, you want to?
Sure. First, thanks so much for having me. It's a great honor to be on and to be included. I live in Boston, Mass. I'm a civil jury trial lawyer. I do exactly the same kind of stuff that Dan supervised when he was head of the New York State Trial Lawyers Association. And on 9/11, I happened to be president of the national organization. It was called at the time the Association of Trial Lawyers of America. And we were the ones who came up with the idea of a victim compensation fund and lobbied it through Congress, and then set up Trial Lawyers Care in the Superior Courthouse in Manhattan to represent clients free of charge. And I get into more detail as we do questions, but that's the overview.
And Dietrich.
Sure. Yeah. I am delighted to be a part of the panel. Sorry, I can't see everybody. As Dan mentioned, I was in the Attorney General's office for a couple of terms when Elliot Spitzer was Attorney General. Before that, I was a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York for just over a decade. And my cases there included the prosecution of Ramzi Youssef, who you'll remember was the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. The prosecution that I did of Youssef was in connection with the so-called Bojinko plot to blow up a dozen air passenger jets over the Pacific. On 9/11, I was in the AG's office, which was then located at 26 Broadway, and I was just arriving at the time the attacks were happening, and I stood in the Attorney General's office on the 20th floor and watched the South Tower collapse just a couple hundred yards away. And then we had to flee along with everyone else who was fortunate to survive that day. After the attacks, you'll recall the 9/11 Commission was set up, the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks Against the United States, and I was the senior counsel in charge of investigating the plot that culminated in the 9/11 attacks, and that work culminated itself in the 9/11 Commission's report, which I participated in writing. All of this seems like a long, long time ago, but the memories are, as they are, I'm sure they are for everyone at that day, just sort of etched permanently in one's mind. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Thank you very much. What I'm going to try to do is ask questions in sort of starting with the more granular and then getting up to the broader issues. So I'm going to first start with Leo because he has some very specific experience. How do the I will say, if you could go into more detail about the role of lawyers and the Association of Trial Lawyers of America and so forth, in particular after 9/11, and I think you noted to me that you could also tell us about the initiation of the Federal Victims Compensation Fund. So those are quite specific areas that perhaps you might address.
I will, and I'll try to keep it short, Dan. Although it's difficult, the amount of history we're all talking about here. But on 9/11, our organization immediately realized that the entire world order had changed, and that would have to have ramifications in the legal world, not just in politics or in international relations or security, but in the legal world. And we learned that by September 12th, the airlines had filed legislation to get financial bailouts and to eliminate any right for any injured party or family of a deceased party to sue anyone. To sue the airlines in particular. And that, of course, would have left all of the victims without a civil remedy, which was unacceptable to us. And so we immediately started planning to push back against that. And what we came up with was the concept of a fund, later known the Victims Compensation Fund. Ken Feinberg, who's also from Massachusetts and has become a good friend, became the special master of the fund. We put it into play on Wednesday, September 19th, in Washington with Dick Gephardt, who was then minority leader, Democratic minority leader in the House. And the concept was simple. Anyone, family of any victim of 9/11 or any injured person could recover from a fund without proving fault and could recover full damages. And the reason we had to do that was the airlines had limited insurance coverage. They were insured per plane, and the total insurance was $3.2 billion. And we knew with the amount of property damage, which was probably $60 or $70 billion, and the horrific loss of life, that the insurance was completely inadequate to cover the loss. So we had to do something. We couldn't leave 3,000 families of lost ones with no remedy at all. So we put the fund into play, and that was exactly a week and a day after the event. It was debated on the 20th. It passed the House and the Senate on the 21st. It was signed into law by President Bush on Saturday, the 22nd. So it's the first fund since the 1960s, which is called an entitlement fund, which means it doesn't depend upon being funded by the current federal budget. You have an absolute right to recover from this fund, and nobody can ask questions, present your claim. We then set up a legal aid service nationwide. We had 2,000 lawyers, all 50 states, 5 countries, and we represented any family who wanted to be represented free of charge. We ended up representing a couple of thousand families. The total amount paid out by the fund was around $7 billion, which is more than twice of what the insurance had been on the airlines. And we believe and we hope that it relieved the families of at least the financial devastation that they all suffered. Our fear was it's bad enough you've lost a loved one. Nobody should lose their house. Nobody should have to bring their children home from college. Nobody should lose their housing because they don't have any money. So that was the concept. And TLC was up and running in New York City for at the courthouse for about 3 years, 3.5 years, and now has become there's a follow-on fund for the people who worked on the wreckage. So that's longer than you needed, but that's it.
That's very good. That's very, very good history and very important. Commissioner, you also had some very specific things to talk about. You were president of the Hispanic Federation, which I believe played a role in the 9/11 efforts. And I wonder if you could say something about that.
Sure. I think as our previous speaker just said, the world order was uprooted with 9/11, and for us at the Hispanic Federation, we had so many emotions going on, like all other New Yorkers. But it was the primary day. We had a leading Puerto Rican as running for mayor, so the impact on that was a great concern. It was also when 9/11 happened, immediately people were thinking about the impact of the financial district and all of the workers in the building. And our voice had to be raised rather quickly to say yes. And there were a lot of backroom operations and restaurant workers and retail workers in that building that do not, fit the profile of where 9/11 was focusing. And so we needed to, put a plan in place addressing all of those issues, and making sure that the Latino community and the Latino families whose family members perished were not left outside of or thought of or an afterthought in the whole service of and supports to the family. And that was a great concern. And and then we had our own issues. We were, 2.5 blocks away from the World Trade Center. And so our operations were shut down. And we were devastated by, we couldn't re-enter our offices and our homes for about, I would say, 2.5 months. And we were very fortunate that United Way gave us space. But it was that confluence of all of those, thinking about your staff. Where were they? I had staff who were coming across on the ferry system. We had staff who came across on the PAP system. And, we were all organizing to do some exit polling around this primary day. So it was all of those issues, and we needed to address them in rapid speed. There was no time to feel sorry or, it was just worry and go into action. And it was like that for about the next 9 months. The challenges over and over again, representing people who were being marginalized by the whole recovery and family building process. And we just were steady and unflinching, and I must say rather fortunate and successful in that we had some relationships with some of the leaders of the 9/11 Fund to make sure that the needs and those families and the processes really were transferable to these families it was not designed to support and it was just not designed to support them. And so that was a real life experience. And I've developed relationships, with Salvation Army and people that we still maintain those relationships, because that was the kind of unity and a camaraderie that you had to do to get ourselves out of this situation, or at least manage the situation. And by the way, I want to just thank you all for doing this. As a CUNY trustee, I'm always delighted when I see CUNY staying on top of issues and bringing new information outside of the realm of the classroom to individuals.
this is great, and I think we may want to come back to this area of helping victims. But for the moment, now I want to switch to a quite different area, and that is the criminal procedure, quite important criminal procedure question. As you may know, we traditionally would prosecute a terrorist in using the ordinary criminal procedure approach of the legal system. But in this case, the decision was made to create this enemy combatant category for them. Now, this wasn't a war against another country, so it wouldn't fit into the traditional military tribunal heading, but we moved away from the usual criminal procedure in this area. And Dieter, if you could not only explain that, but perhaps share your thoughts on the significance and virtues or lack thereof of that policy.
Yes, that's a great question, Dan. And I think it might be useful to just do a little history as background to 9/11. 9/11 was by no means the first terrorist attack in this country. In fact, it was motivated, I believe, by similar ideas that had motivated the original World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And that was, I think that's generally considered to be the origin of terrorist attacks in the U.S. There have been isolated incidents previously, but none of the scale or notoriety that the first World Trade Center bombing commanded when it happened in 1993. But at that time, everyone just treated it, presumed it would be treated, and treated it as a massive crime, which it certainly was. And the FBI did a comprehensive investigation of 4 perpetrators who participated in that plot were identified and apprehended. The mastermind, the leader of the plot, actually was able to escape the same day as the attack. He remained a fugitive for a couple of years, and there was a worldwide search for him. But the whole matter was investigated, charged, and prosecuted as a crime. And the defendants were convicted. They were sentenced to life in prison. And I don't think anyone really thought of it as anything other than a crime. That changed with 9/11, and actually it sort of changed even just a few years before 9/11 when Osama bin Laden issued his fatwa, his declaration of war against the United States. At the time, nobody except maybe a few people in the intelligence community paid any attention to that. But they paid attention a couple of years after, actually later that year, in 1998, when our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were attacked, and that was in connection with the declaration that bin Laden had issued. And then, of course, 9/11 was there was actually the Cole attack in 2000, and then 9/11 happened. And at that point, everyone saw this as this attack on our country and an act of war. And war is a completely different magnitude, completely different scale from just prosecuting isolated crime. It's something that the country has had a history with, but this was different because, as Dan mentioned, there's no country that had attacked us. There were people who saw themselves as something of a group, Al Qaeda, but they were not a nation state. And how do you wage a war like this? and it became a long saga in and of itself. Just the theater in Afghanistan, which is only very recently closed. But the individuals who were apprehended in the course of the war on terror, and there were hundreds of them. They were detained and they were interned at Guantanamo Bay, and they remain there to this day. They've never had a trial yet. It's supposed to be happening, but it's been delayed continually. There was an effort initially to have them tried as in the criminal court, the U.S. District Court in Lower Manhattan, where USEF and the Regional World Trade Center bombing defendants had been tried, but that politically became impossible to do. I think the consensus was that security would never be possible to maintain. The Lower Manhattan already had suffered 2 horrific attacks, and it just was not considered to be a viable option. But there was another problem too with treating the World Trade Center, the 9/11 bombing conspiracy members, as criminal defendants, and that was the whole intelligence extraction aspect, shall we say, the enhanced interrogation techniques that were used, and what would the effect be there, and how could those be squared with the normal criminal process that we're used to in our system? And as a result, with all these factors, there's never been a trial. They have the military commission that is supposed to handle these cases, and it remains to be seen 20 years later if that actually will come to pass. So it's a unique set of circumstances, one, and I think that there are a lot of people who are very concerned that it could become a precedent and could have some very serious civil liberties ramifications if that were to become the case. So I think most people hope that this is a unique circumstance that we won't see repeated, but it raises all sorts of very difficult questions that I certainly can't say that I have the answer to, but I think it's an important issue that people should remember and be aware of.
Well, thank you very much. Those are some important thoughts. Charles, I think I know that you've given some thought to the role of the public in trying to press for 9/11 investigations, reforms, and so forth. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, sure. I think, and as much as I love the legal questions, I think they're really fascinating and certainly do resonate to this day. And many of them are unresolved, as was pointed out. But the other thing I think that was really important, I'd want to impart to people, if I only could tell them one thing, was that if you look back at the history of 9/11, and it was not, there was a lot of official opposition to almost every major oversight or remedial action that took place following 9/11. That is to say that we look back and now, and it's interesting having, been in the field, and now you have organizations that didn't even exist on 9/11 that took the occasion of 9/11 to kind of celebrate, their origins, when in fact their origins were very contentious. And so as an example, I think it starts, and the Hispanic community, that was a huge area of advocacy. And I remember it vividly that because there was this kind of stereotypical image of the World Trade Center worker as, stockbroker or a white collar, somebody who was very much in the kind of office professional, mold. And nobody talked about, restaurant workers and delivery and building staff and all those people and many of them were contractors who were not employed by the Port Authority. But to get back to the origin of the question, or the origin of my answer, is that, when we started off And I think the Daily News had a piece by Joe Calderone in October, early October of 2001. And myself and Glenn Corbett here at John Jay, who teaches in the fire science program, we had always been advocates for after-action reporting and documenting large-scale events such as this. And it was unbelievable to us. It was kind of disbelief. I'd open the newspaper every day, and nobody was asking any of the hard questions. Nobody was saying, gee, did something maybe, could we have done something better? So when Joe Calderone finally called to get, ask about it, we both pounced on that opportunity. And that was immensely unpopular at the time. And I got, calls from contacts in the police and the fire department who basically said, are you sure you know what you're doing here? And people just, would shake their head and say, well, you might be doing the right thing, but you're going to pay a price. And indeed, we did pay a price, but that comes later on in the story, a few years down the line. But, so Sally Regenhard got in, and Sally is the mother of what it turned out to be a firefighter who perished, a probationary firefighter about a month onto the job at the time, really had the moral authority, working with the technical experts. And she very much channeled her energies, and she was a savvy person who worked in the healthcare industry and was not naive to politics and how things work. And so she got involved in advocacy, and we worked symbiotically with her. And she decided to focus on a couple of areas, one of which was high-rise building safety, which was a big story unto itself in terms of the fact that the Port Authority, not to go too far into the weeds, but the Port Authority is an independent agency, technically did not have to meet the New York City building and fire codes. And so there were conditions in that building that were really less than optimal. And so that was an issue. There was also, of course, the 9/11 Commission, which people need to be reminded that the Bush administration was virulently opposed to having a 9/11 Commission. And there was a lot of opposition to it and a lot of resistance. And then the other piece was the investigation of the response to 9/11. McKinsey and Company did a pro bono report, one for the fire department, one for the police department, which were decent reports. I would say they're not as expansive as they should have been. But the actual study of the collapse of the building and the dynamics was done initially by FEMA with a group of volunteer civil engineers, good people from the Structural Engineers Association of New York, but they were uncompensated. And you'll recall at the same time this is happening, the site is being cleared and structural members are being loaded onto barges and sent off to New Jersey to sit in a scrapyard before they get recycled. And so there was really a lot of urgency around that. And so there was advocacy around to get a fully funded investigation. And John Jay was played a part in that, and that we convened an experts group that included the Centers for Disease Control and human behavior and fire evacuation experts from around the world came to John Jay and had a meeting. And CDC, Centers for Disease Control, which has a mission on injury prevention, which these days probably everybody's forgotten about with COVID, very quickly funded studies on evacuation of the World Trade Center. And at Columbia University very quickly jumped in and scooped that money up and did a number of reports in that area. And some of John Jay faculty subsequently got involved as consultants in that effort. And then the National Institute of Standards and Technology came in for the first time and were funded, I think, to the tune of like $45 million to go in and study the evacuation and what happened structurally in that building, the World Trade Center towers, as well as number 7 World Trade. And so that was a major undertaking politically. And there's a lot of very grassroots and politicking and public advocacy. I mean, Sally had people doing sleepouts outside in the wintertime. She went to hearings in Congress. We had a lot of support at the time from Representative Sherwood Boyle, who regrettably just passed away. It was from up in Utica. He was the chair of the House Science Committee. and really remarkable. I don't know what it would happen today, or certainly not as easily, but he saw the need for learning from that event, and was instrumental in ultimately passing a piece of federal legislation, National Construction Safety Team Act, which ended up giving NIST statutory authority to investigate large engineering failures. And in fact, it was just invoked in Surfside, Florida, for that condo collapse. So that's probably gone on long enough. So I'll turn it back, Dan.
Thank you very much, Charles. I would like to give each panelist the opportunity to comment on or respond to anything that was said by other panelists, but there's one issue in particular that I would hope a couple of you might be willing to address, and that is, we're talking about the legacy of 9/11, and we've talked about some very positive aspects of that legacy in terms of finding ways to compensate victims and also mobilizing public support for some technical structural issues that we faced, and so on and so forth. But Dietrich touched on began to touch on what many people, myself included, worry about certain negative aspects of that legacy. There are those who have attributed a certain amount of paranoia, bigotry, xenophobia, and so forth. Whether those elements played a role in the prosecutorial or incarcerative, incarcerally, I can't say the word right, but the incarcerative response to 9/11 and so forth is a matter of some concern. So I wonder if particularly perhaps Leo or Dieter again, or really any of the panelists would care to comment on what may be some troubling aspects of this legacy.
I'm not qualified on the criminal side, other than to be aware as a citizen of the concerns, the civil rights concerns following some of the legislation. But on the civil side, if I could move it over to that, there was great concern that the fund that we came up with, the whole concept, would become a substitute or a model that would take away the right to trial by jury. And I've been trying cases, as I said earlier, for 50 years, mostly in downtown Boston, in Suffolk County. And nobody has more veneration and reverence for trial by jury than I do. And so we were faced with this enormous problem at the beginning, that there simply was not enough insurance to take care of all of the damage. And if we didn't do something dramatically different from the civil jury system, people would get 2 or 3 cents on the dollar for the harm they had suffered. So we were at a huge crossroads, because we've always defended the right to trial by jury, and yet in this instance, it wouldn't work. We could preserve it perhaps in theory, and in practice, we would end up with thousands of families disenfranchised by our blindness to the practical side. But it was really hard in the legal community to get people to think outside the box and say, we have to do something. And the way my construct in my mind was that this was not a mass tort. Now, the lawyers on the call, a mass tort is where you have like asbestos or some pharmaceutical that harms lots of people. I saw this as a mass murder, not a mass tort. And that's how I tried to communicate it, as being separate from the jury system. We had, this was a one-off, and we had to craft something. The other piece that I'll never forget is how quickly large interests will act to preserve themselves at the expense of others. Literally, by September 12, lobbyists were on the Hill in Washington to exonerate the airlines from all responsibility. Literally. And as stunning as that was, and hats off to the firefighters of New York. The union president at the time, and I'm embarrassed I don't remember his name, because he wrote the most gorgeous letter that we took into Congress. Maybe somebody on the line can remember that gentleman's name. And it just bristled with his outrage that the fire's not even out, and the airlines want to be exonerated from all responsibility. And I know he wasn't a lawyer. He was a firefighter. He was the union president, and he spoke with such eloquence in that letter, and it had enormous political force when we distributed it throughout Congress. And it made me realize that when something like this happens, you have to act immediately, and you have to take these gigantic steps that in normal times you'd deliberate for years before you did them. But you didn't have time. I mean, this was all done in 60 hours. I got to Washington on Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. was our first meeting, the 19th of September. And by the 21st, it was law. And by the 22nd, it was signed. So we had no time to think. We had to make these decisions that were contrary to our core beliefs in trial by jury. So, and I'm happy to say that in retrospect, as time has gone on, this has not become a model to destroy the jury system, because it was so unique. It was a mass murder, not a mass tort. I've talked too much, but that was my takeaway on the civil side. I'd love to hear Dieter on the criminal side, because I'd love to hear Dan, the direct response to your question.
Dieter, you want to?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that really sums it up appropriately to say that it's important not to consider 9/11 as a model for anything except, God forbid, another disaster or catastrophe on that scale. It's something that one hopes is unique in our history, which is not to say it shouldn't be studied and it shouldn't be learned from. It absolutely should. And steps need to be taken to try to prevent something like that from ever occurring again. And that's what we live with today to an extent. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when you could walk into any office building in Manhattan. Just walk right in and go straight to the elevators and up to the floor where you were going. No check-in, no security down below. Mm-hmm. In fact, on September 11, 2001, I believe there was only one office building complex in Manhattan, a general office building that had that kind of security, where you had to check in downstairs and show an ID. That was the World Trade Center, because they had the experience from '93. So we do learn by looking back, but it's not enough either. And that's the big challenge. That's the tension that we all face and we have to live with. We need to remember, we also need to make sure that we don't overreact and decide that we're going to be using a catastrophic event or set of events as a precedent by which we're going to just live forever going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I often think about the fact that my children and anyone of the younger generations simply never knew a world in which there wasn't this kind of heightened security, in which you did not see soldiers with machine guns walking around Penn Station, or you really just, it's a somewhat broader issue than just, you also wouldn't see traffic stops where police randomly stop people to see if they're carrying drugs. The sense of personal freedom when in the 1950s, when I was a child, simply was much stronger and broader than it is today. And most Americans today never experienced that. And that is of considerable concern to me. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. I want to give each panelist an opportunity to respond or comment to any of the other, and we had so many interesting and important thoughts today. It's hard to keep them all in mind, but if we can, I'd like to ask the panelists to comment on any of the aspects of these comments that we have heard so far. If you're going to be shy, then I'll ask somebody, but otherwise maybe somebody will volunteer and step forward.
Sure, I'll start and just say that I think the lesson for me and for people listening is that, things after a disaster, the political forces that exist prior to disaster or prior to an event don't go away, as we saw with the airline industry protecting themselves. We saw similar action during the COVID pandemic with nursing home industry. So those forces are there, and if advocates and people don't move forcefully and collectively to do what ought to be done, I think the forces of the status quo to kind of bring everything back to pre-disaster state are very powerful and will act very quickly. And if you look again at the 9/11 Commission, and we take it for granted, as I said, but there's a whole list of issues, stumbling blocks that were placed in front of them by the Bush administration. In terms of denial of funding, denial of witnesses, denial of access to records, and so when we look back on it, we still have this image that's been portrayed that America joined hands and we all were unified and it was wonderful. And while those things did happen down in D.C. and in the halls of legislative bodies around the country, it was very much business as usual, and those forces did not go away. And so it was only through the intervention of people who got motivated to make sure that the right thing got done, that the status quo didn't prevail.
Yeah. And as you know, Dieter was senior counsel to that commission, so I imagine he may have been close to those circumstances.
Yeah, Dieter, actually, how come you're letting me talk about the 9/11 Commission?
Well, you definitely hit it on the head. We faced a lot of obstacles, but one thing I will say that I think made the commission successful, and I think it's generally agreed that it was a successful project, is that the leadership, Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton, one a Republican, one a Democrat, decided from the get-go that they were going to make sure there was a bipartisan consensus on all the decisions, and they did it. There were Republicans and Democrats and quite partisan ones on both sides who were also among the commissioners. But Tom and Lee worked together in such a way that the consensus emerged in a way that is reminiscent of some of the higher accomplishments in the history of this country, where the value of consensus was recognized and not just paid lip service to. And I think that was an enormous lesson, certainly for me, and I think for a lot of people, to see that could happen. It's almost inconceivable, unfortunately, these days, when you look at what happened in Washington in recent years and is going on still today. Almost inconceivable that you could get that level of bipartisanship, but we did, and I think the country benefited tremendously. The other thing that I would add quickly is I was struck by the comments about organizing the relief services and getting all of these forces to work together. That was very much the experience that I had in the Attorney General's office as we were trying to harness all of the charitable interest, this outpouring of activity and determination on the part of countless charities to provide relief. And of course, they never worked together before. They're basically competitors. But they got together, and under the Attorney General, which had the authority to regulate charities, actually in New York, we were able to get an enormously cooperative effort together to help with the relief effort. And that's a positive that I can look back on and say, we are capable of doing that sort of thing and overcoming the divisions that do exist and are a very real part of human nature and life, unfortunately, but they can be overcome.
Commissioner, we haven't heard from you in a while. Perhaps you could share your reactions and thoughts on some of these things. Is the commissioner still with us? Oh, sounds like perhaps not. Well, I don't know whether, for anybody that doesn't know, our initial, the person who prompted this conversation was Mindy Bockstein, who herself has deep experience and knowledge about the whole 9/11 experience. I don't know whether we're allowed to call on her for comment. Mindy, are you permitted to engage here or not? No. Okay. I guess I'm not getting a response there, so I better not. Okay. Any other final thoughts, or else I guess we can wrap up.
Dan, could I just commend Charles for his insights that I just heard in this last round, and he's got it dead right. The status quo doesn't change just because some nightmarish thing has happened. People have to step up and make it change. And I heard, I'm not as familiar as I'd like to be with his work, but I heard in what Charles said that he took a hard look at could things have been done better, and he was told stay away from that and don't ask questions and don't think critically about how can we be better in the future, and don't think about change. And he apparently didn't back down, and there's a huge lesson in that. So I can't second enough what Charles has said in a very elegant way about responding to things like this in the future.
Yeah. Well, I share your gratitude, but I also extend it to you and to Dieter and to the Commissioner, to Charles. This is just a fabulous panel, and I'm just immensely grateful to all of you for doing this. And with that, I guess I don't know if I can turn this back over to Dr. Foster. Gina, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you all so much. I feel again humbled and privileged and graced by all you've shared. I'm so glad we'll be able to share this with a wider audience. I wish you well, and please continue helping us create a better world. Thank you.